You're listening to episode 239 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Rick Heller returns to tell us about secular meditation, 32 practices for cultivating inner peace, compassion, and joy, a guide from the humanist community at Harvard. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast, which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. Secular Buddhism is a concept which has, as a natural outgrowth, secular meditation. Still with more than a passing relationship to its Buddhist background, secular meditation nonetheless is finding appeal with a wide audience of secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and scoundrels like us. Rick Heller is the editor of the online magazine, The New Humanism, a publication of the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard University. He is also a facilitator of the Humanist Mindfulness Group in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He has guided mindfulness and loving-kindness meditations at Occupy Boston. Rick's writing has appeared in The Humanist, Tikkun, Free Inquiry, UU World, and Buddha Dharma magazines, and in the Boston Globe and Lowell Sun. Rick holds a Master in Public Policy degree from Harvard's Kennedy School, a Master of Science degree in Journalism from Boston University, and a Bachelor of Science in Electric Engineering degree from MIT. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Boston Tea Party light. Our guest today is Rick Heller. Rick, thanks for coming back. Nice to speak with you again.
Hey, nice to talk to you, Ted.
Very glad to have you here, and it's always nice when you can join us on our Sunday night practice circle. Thanks for that. I will confess that folks who are listening, Rick is one of the folks that I get to see every now and then as a regular attendee to our groups, and I'm very glad to have you there. So we're here to talk about your new book. When we last spoke, you were with us on episode 104 regarding the new humanism. Since then, what's been happening? What's been going on?
Well, the humanist meditation has continued. We've been meditating now for about 6 years. Now we meet weekly every Tuesday night in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And if folks want to drop by sometime, they'd be most welcome. We list ourselves actually as Cambridge Secular Buddhists on Meetup, if people are looking for that. And that was inspired by you, Ted, originally. I didn't actually start this group, but someone else did, and it's kind of been absorbed into the humanist community. The humanist, I guess I'll talk a little bit about that. That we have something called the Humanist Hub. HumanistHub.org is the sort of mothership of humanism, and in the Boston area. There's a lot of things going on. There's Tuesday night meditations. Every Sunday, there's a talk of one sort or another. Greg Epstein is the director of the humanist community. He's been doing this for, I'd say, probably 10 years, if I'm correct. And things have really built up over time. And there's other activities as well.
Terrific. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the humanist community at Harvard. It sounds like there are at least some regular meditators.
So we do, the weekly meditation. We do have people who come back week after week, and we also have people just checking out for the first time. What I would say is we're still pretty much on the beginning to intermediate side of things. We haven't done any kind of retreat or anything like that. We're actually thinking of doing that for the first time. I would sort of just see myself as an intermediate at this rather than an expert. So sometimes it's a matter of you might do it, you might do things over and over again, but that doesn't necessarily mean your skill increases higher and higher.
A coworker just today was saying, even with 10,000 hours of singing practice, I'll still never have a good voice. So, Rick, let's shift a little bit and talk about the book. What made you decide to write it? This one isn't primarily Buddhist, is it?
Well, it's secular meditation. So basically, and I give this introduction when people come, Buddhist practices are themselves, for the most part, secular, although one thing with the metta practice, which is actually one of the metta or loving kindness meditation, one of the things I do, I tweak the wording a little bit. So, the wording that's commonly used is something like, may I be happy, may I be healthy, things along those lines. And that just has a little bit of a sound like a prayer. It's sort of funny because it's not at all clear who one might be praying to, but it still kind of sounds a little bit like a prayer. And I know that some of the people from the humanist community might attend. Really, that sort of would be a little bit off-putting to them. So I reworded. So I thought about that. What are you really saying there? And basically, it's a hope or a desire. So in the form that I present, it's I would like so and so to be healthy. I would like so and so to be happy. The other thing, of course, I specify is from our perspective, there's no action at a distance. To the extent that one expresses a wish, the only way it really makes a difference is because it changes your own brain, and then subsequently it might change your own behavior. So if you are practicing loving kindness toward a person, then, the next time you encounter that person, that meditation might have affected them. But we try to put everything in a context that's very understandable to a person who has no religious leanings, let's say.
And you went through a few ups and downs with getting it published. Tell a little bit of that.
Well, actually, once I got the final product, it actually went all right. I started writing in 1986. It wasn't this book at that point. There's probably a page or two of what I wrote in 1986 still here. And actually, one of the things I do have in this book is the stories of a few people, including myself and including several other people who attend the meditation group, talking about what kind of got them into meditation in the first place. And I tell my own story, which goes back to 1986, when I had some challenges with pain. And that, in fact, had been fairly long-standing for the previous 8 years. So it actually goes probably back into the 70s if you talk about this dealing with the pain. And ultimately, it was really eye strain. And I finally went to a ophthalmologist at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School, near where I lived at the time. And he told me that my eyes were fine, but that I had become hyper vigilant to pain sensations. And he kind of explained how that could be. And I had this sort of epiphany that I realized that was true, that I did have this sort of personality that sort of perseverated on those things. There's a little more to it than just that. But basically what I would put it in the context now is this idea of really probably the second noble truth within the Four Noble Truths, that when you are averse to something and try to push it away, that actually increases suffering. And I experienced that to an extreme degree. I didn't have any kind of Buddhist terminology or mindfulness terminology. I had never meditated at this point. So this was all within the context, basically, of ophthalmology.
Now, that's a Dharma door I have not heard of before.
Although the interesting thing is that the place I went to, UCSF, was actually the place where some of the pioneering research on the placebo response and its connection to opioid neurotransmission was done at UCSF. I don't know if this doctor who treated me knew about that, but I kind of think that the ideas were at least in the air in that particular medical school. So this was, for me, it was a question of the sort of placebo effect or the downside. There's actually a term is now called nocebo effect for the negative power of negative beliefs. That experience sort of shook me up in a lot of ways because although I had been grown up religious, I'd actually become an atheist. And I was very much scoffing of things like meditation. I thought that was crazy stuff. And it was after that I opened my mind a little bit and I took my first meditation class. It was actually a very secular meditation class at the YWCA in San Francisco. I actually went there to swim. I saw a sign that said, hey, meditation class. I thought, all right, maybe I'll try it.
This fits in so well with my ophthalmology issues. I got to be there.
And it was actually a very secular class because it was taught kind of like exercise. I think the teacher was perhaps a yoga teacher. And it was very secular. And after that, I did breath meditation. And I did breath meditation after that for probably 20 years that breath meditation was the only thing I did. I didn't know about this other stuff. I didn't know the word mindfulness. This was back in 1986. So, and I was sort of just with that. And as I actually moved from California to the East Coast, I was probably doing a little bit less because certainly East Coast 10 years ago, it wasn't trendy like it's become now. But what happened with me about 10 years ago, I was in an airplane. My wife and I, we happened to be sitting next to a fellow who was actually a professor at Naropa University in Colorado. We were going out to the West, and we got into this long conversation about Buddhism and meditation. And he suggested I try the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, which I had not heard of, but subsequently was very helpful to me. And a lot of the practices that I go into in the book really come from what I learned at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center and subsequently other really insight meditation oriented workshops like a Jack Kornfield workshop that I attended. And then finally, after I've been doing that for a while, Greg Epstein at the Humanist Hub knew that there were a couple people involved at the Hub who were involved in meditation. There's a fellow named Zach Alexander who's actually a secular Quaker. And he practiced that form of meditation. And Zach actually had the initiative in this, in kind of forming the meditation group. But then he moved, and I've been the person who's carried it forth for a number of years now. So that's kind of how I got into the meditation. But in terms of the writing, I actually got the crazy idea to write a book pretty shortly after this experience in 1986. I don't think I ever told you about this, but I attended a lecture by M. Scott Peck. He wrote the book The Road Less Traveled, which was a huge bestseller in that era. And he encouraged people who were attending to essentially do something crazy. Just like listen to your inner voice. And if your inner voice says something crazy and sort of out of reach and absurd, like really think about that and consider doing it. And actually, so the next time I don't remember if it was a meditation or whatever, but I asked my inner voice to what I should do. And it suggested writing a book. In retrospect, it was really premature because it's taken basically 28 years. I actually did write a book right then. I mean, within a couple of years, I had a book length. But in the subsequent years, I've written a memoir, 2 novels, screenplays, another memoir. But the basic thing that ultimately helped, I would say, was going to journalism school, which I went to journalism school at Boston University in 2005, and I learned how to become a professional writer at that point. And working as a reporter, which I've never been a full-time reporter, but I have worked professionally part-time as a reporter.
So tell us about the structure of the book itself. It's a little different than some others. What's in there?
Well, it's actually structured about the practices. I have 32 practices for cultivating inner peace, compassion, and joy. And I actually start off with the loving kindness or the compassion and loving kindness practices, rather than with the mindfulness of breath practices. It's been my feeling, at least with a secular community, that it might be easier to communicate the sort of loving kindness ideas rather than mindfulness, because sometimes when I talk about mindfulness, although it's becoming increasingly understood what it is, but even certainly a few years ago, talk to people about mindfulness, they don't know what it is. And then if I try to define it, they still don't really know what it is, because you really have to experience it. The sort of feeling of being present, it doesn't really get captured by a definition. So, but on the other hand, when I talk about sort of loving kindness meditation and cultivating warm feelings and things like that, that's actually something people can get right away, because they've experienced that already. So they have that language communicates. And also, I feel that the loving kindness meditation is a guided meditation. There's a lot of anxieties, it seems, sometimes for people who will say, well, I really can't quiet my mind. So I kind of think for a secular audience, going through the loving kindness and compassion practices might be the easiest way to sort of get into this and start to see, hey, this does something useful. So I do have 4 sections of the book, and then chapters within those sections. The first section is composed of the cultivating love and compassion. The second part is focused on sort of quieting the mind, things like breath meditation, ambient sound meditation. The part 3, which I call cultivating joy, is kind of like the fun stuff. It includes contemplative photography and going to the museum and mindfully observing the museum exhibits and sort of things like that. And then in the final section, I have some additional practices which are a little bit of a grab bag. So, for instance, I do have meditative reading, which was actually inspired not from Buddhism, but the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, who, in the spiritual exercises, the person is encouraged to read the Bible and try to visualize the scene vividly and put themselves in not as a protagonist, but as an observer. And so I took the same idea, but I used a text by Thoreau, the one where he's canoeing up the Merrimack River, and we used that actually at one of our Tuesday night meditations and did a meditative exercise that way. So just kind of a few different things like that.
Yeah, and I like the interplay of the exercises with stories around them too. It makes for an interesting read. I was very glad to see that. So, Rick, from your point of view, what makes this a more unique book? Who might be more interested in it?
Well, one of the other aspects of it is that I have, through my journalism background, I have incorporated some reporting on research. And in terms of how the book itself came into being, I first got it published different parts in some different magazines, Buddha Dharma magazine, Tikkun magazine, the Humanist magazine. So there were some different bits in those magazines that were basically journalism. In that process, I've interviewed a number of scientists, both neuroscientists and psychologists. And I've also interviewed Buddhist teachers as well. So there is some journalism in this. The format of the way it works is I try to envision it as each chapter pretty much as if a person was coming to one of our Tuesday night meditations. So we start off with an introduction to the practice. Then we have the exercise itself, the meditative exercise, and then a discussion after. And that's actually something we do on Tuesday nights. We do go around and have a discussion about our experiences, as well as what we call joys and concerns, where people can bring up just emotional issues that are going on in their lives. We try to make this sort of the emotional side of humanism. A lot of, if one goes to humanist events, a lot of times they are often very sort of intellectual lectures, let's say. And we've tried to make these things to be more taking care of the emotional side of people. But as part of that discussion, in addition to including discussion of how people reacted to these meditations when we tried them out at the Humanist Hub, I also, in some cases, bring in discussion of the research that has been done on the various types of meditation.
So skeptics, atheists, humanists, this one's for you.
Bring them on, the most skeptical person. I can certainly see, there's some people I know within the humanist community that, I don't know, for whatever reason, they just don't like meditation. I don't go skiing, whatever. You don't have to do it. But I don't think they're going to find anything that is like really off. I mean, obviously, I'm not perfect. There could be some errors in here, but the errors are just the typical errors that any humanist skeptical person might write, just because every person is fallible. But everything I've written is with the idea that the most skeptical person might be reading this, and it needs to be certainly plausible. I try to qualify how solid is the research. Is this something that seems to be pretty solid? Is it something that is a hypothesis but not proved? And things like that.
Excellent. And let's take that opportunity to unpack something that often comes up in these discussions, particularly from a skeptic's point of view, is what about this enlightenment thing? And maybe, Rick, you can talk about that for a few minutes. What does that mean to you?
I do get into this in the end. This is in addition to actual exercises, I have some frequently asked questions that I go into. So with regard to the Buddhist ideas of enlightenment, I'm not entirely sure that I go for it. I often hear people talk about sort of this understanding that the sense of self is not sort of enduring. But I would say personally, I have not gotten to the point where I experience these things. So for me, I can't say from personal experience that makes a great deal of sense to me. Although I do respect when people say that they've experienced that, I do believe that there is a brain state that people can get into where there is this transformation of the sense of self. So I do accept that occurs in people. But so number one, I've never experienced it myself. But also number two, I'm not convinced that if people get to that point, does that really make their life better? Does that make them better actors in society? I don't know. And I don't think there's not a lot of statistical evidence because there's not so many people, there's not the number of people to study is difficult. And you can't do a randomized clinical trial where you bring a person to enlightenment over a period of, 3 months, right? And so it's really, to the extent that there's information about it all, it's anecdotal. And I know there actually is I think a contemplative development study working toward this, but at this point, that part is very premature.
I'm curious what we would call a unit of measure of enlightenment. That's a challenge for the listeners. Come up with a word, send that in. I'd like to know what that might be.
I read something by Ajahn Thansaru, who I thought, to me, made a lot of sense to get to the point of equanimity where basically you are in a good state, and that state is coming from your internal resources. So that, and I do believe this is possible through practice such as mindfulness and the loving kindness meditation, that you can get to the point where your own internal state is in pretty good, and it's independent of really much of what is going on in the world. And I do qualify that by saying I think people have to have the very basic physical needs of food, shelter, and health care met, because meditative practices actually make demands on the brain. And there's probably glucose is the thing that powers much of what goes on in the brain. So if a person does not have these basic physical needs met, I don't think they'd really be able to actually practice mindfulness effectively. But once the basic needs are met, I think we actually do have the ability to self-generate happiness and moment-to-moment joy. And you can then get to the state where what's actually going on in the world does not shift you off of that too much. That if something good happens, like your book is published, let's say, that will make you someone happier. But it doesn't bring you necessarily even way up, because you're already kind of at a pretty good state. So that's and of course, and again, if something bad happens, inevitably we do get sick and we do die. Hopefully that one can stay at a pretty good state until that inevitability occurs. So that's actually kind of what I'm trying to work toward. Not that I'm at it and I forget. And even though I sometimes I forget about this in the moment. And then when I look at the book and I read this, oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to be doing.
Very nice. Appreciate that. So what else are you working on? You mentioned some things before we started the recording tonight. What's that about?
Well, I do have a website now, and in the website, I am starting to interview people about. Certainly, my book is called Secular Meditation, so I am interviewing people about meditation, mindfulness, but also interviewing people about secularism. And I haven't done this yet, but I'm actually also interested in interviewing sort of religious folks about the ongoing secularization of society, because an interesting news story that occurred is that this was reported in the Washington Post, but actually at Harvard University, the entering freshman class, atheists and agnostics are now the leading category. They exceed, if I recall correctly, Christians. And that's quite a change. And certainly people who are secular, find that something to celebrate. However, I actually have both a joy and a concern with that. My concern is I do believe that religion did teach people to draw upon inner resources. And certainly Buddhism is something that does teach people to draw upon inner resources. And if a sort of religion is discarded entirely, I wonder if people will be increasingly oriented toward finding their satisfaction only with external stuff, consumer items and things like that. So I'm interested in talking to people about questions related to secularization and also mindfulness.
Excellent. Looking forward to that. Is there anything else you want to share with the listeners?
Well, again, on the sort of enlightenment thing, and I don't consider myself to be enlightened by a long shot, but I do believe that ultimately our moment-to-moment happiness, feelings of joy are self-generated within our bodies, and that if something occurs that makes us happy, that facilitates our own body's ability to produce joy. So, for instance, if your favorite baseball team wins a big game and you're very excited, and let's just say you heard about that, you actually weren't watching it, that's a piece of news, that's a piece of information. Why does a piece of printed information on the internet excite you? That piece of print has no ability. It's because you absorb that information and that it then caused you to generate these feelings of happiness. And I think we actually have the ability to self-generate using practices like loving kindness meditation, which it teaches at first to develop feelings of kindness toward other people, but you can actually develop those feelings of kindness not just toward people, but to inanimate objects in actually every moment and every stimulus in your life.
Excellent. Thank you very much. For folks who are interested in finding out more, rickheller.com is the website. And we also have a link to the book itself. Rick, thanks for being here. Good talking with you again.
Oh, thank you, Ted. Good talking with you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.